Welcome back to the shop. It's time to get construction really going on the SBR OmegA. Now the instructions would have me install the motor mount into the main body tube first, but there's a couple things I want to do instead. I'm going to change the order on how I'm going to do these next couple steps here. First things first though, I need to fill in the body tube spirals. So I'm going to spare you that pain and take care of that right now. Alright, so I've put the filler on the main body tube, so I'm going to set that aside and allow the filler to dry. Now while I'm doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up the motor mount to allow me to do internal fillets. As you can see, I've already installed the aft centering ring, and unlike rockets that I've had in the past, the fins on this rocket sit up a little bit higher on the main body tube than all the way back. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to mark and measure where all 4 fins are going to go, and we're going to build something called a fin pocket to allow the epoxy to stay close to the fins when I glue them in place. That'll allow them to have a nice internal fillet without having to come back in a second time to add them. And since I can't anyway, this is the best way to ensure the best bond from the fins to the motor mount. Now all we need to do to add those fin pockets is use some paper here. We've got scissors, pencil, and some scrap balsa wood. Let's get to work. Alright, first thing I need to do is mark the motor mount where the fins are going to go. To do that, I'll just use the technique that I pretty much always use, and that's just using a piece of paper here, wrap it around. I'm going to mark where the paper overlaps. There we go. Now I'm going to just trim the paper down a little bit here. And since I have 4 fins, just going to fold the paper over twice. And with the fin pockets, this doesn't have to be a precise measurement, so that's kind of nice. Now I'm just going to grab some tape. I'm going to wrap this back around and secure it in place, and I'll mark where all the fins go. Alright, that's pretty secure there, so just a little pencil mark on each of the lines here. That's all I really need. And that's going to be spaced apart well enough that it'll be nice and easy to see where the fins go. And like I said, it doesn't have to be perfect, but I have 4 evenly spaced marks now. Now what I'm going to do to extend the lines out, so I'm just going to use this little sanding block here that's got a nice 90-degree angle on it. Just set that against the tube, mark the lines. There we go. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to mark arrows all in the same direction here. Like so. And this will show me where to put my fin pockets here in just a minute. Okay, so the fins are 3/16 of an inch on this rocket, so just to make things easier, we're going to call them a 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be perfect here. So what I want to do is I want to make fin pockets that are twice as big as the fin. So we're going to call it 1/2 of an inch is the width that I want to give each fin, plus a little bit of space for their internal fillet. So it's hard to talk and mark at the same time, but as you can see, what I'm doing here is I'm going in the same direction on all these markings, 1/2 of an inch. There we are. And with those marks in place, just draw the lines out like so, and this will give me the width for each area for the fin plus its fillet. There we are. Now I'm just going to draw a line about down the center here, and it doesn't have to be perfect. There we go. And this is just to help me sight these in when I put the motor mount in place. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my scrap balsa, cut it to length, about the same length as the fin here, and I'm just going to glue it in place along these lines that I've drawn. So the fins on the OmegA are 7 inches long at the root, or thereabouts. So what I did was I made 2 dams for each fin, so 8 total, and they're 7 inches long. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to glue these dams along the lines that I've drawn, and I'm just going to use CA glue. It doesn't have to be super strong. And we'll put all of them in place, and that'll make a nice area for the fin to glue into. Okay, with all the dams in place, that creates the pockets for the fin to be glued into. Now it looks a little bit wide, but that's okay. Once you get the width of the fin in place, it'll hold the glue pretty close to the fin and allow for a nice strong joint. After assembling the motor mount and filling in the tube spirals on the lower body tube, the instructions would first have me put the motor mount into the body tube. And as you can see, it fits pretty well. I did have to sand the centering rings just a little bit for it to fit well. However, when you're done putting the motor mount in place, there's a little bit of an overhang here, and one of the steps a little bit further down the road is to install these aft centering rings flush with the bottom end of the booster tube. So instead of putting in the motor mount right away, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set it aside, and I'm going to set the booster tube up vertically on my table. In this way, I can make sure it's sitting nice and flush with the table, as well as the centering rings there. So I'm just going to do this a little bit out of order. It's not a big deal. Everything else will work out just fine. Alright, so I've got the booster tube set vertically on my work table here, and before I get started with actually putting the rings together, I just want to give you an example of how easy it is to find parts in this kit. Here's what the aft booster ring looks like, and as you can see, it was laser etched into the wood. So it's super easy to pick out which part you need for the different assemblies, and especially these centering rings. There's actually quite a few centering rings that come with the kit. So it's nice and easy to be able to pick them out with these laser etching. Alright, so what you're looking at here is actually the bottom end of the booster tube. I've got my 2 centering rings put in place. They did take some sanding to fit over the booster tube. I ended up actually using my Dremel with a sanding drum that worked out really well for sanding the inside radius of these centering rings. So the instructions call for epoxy to put these in place. I'm just going to use wood glue instead. I think that'll work just fine. And with the rocket being upside down, I'm going to put a bead of wood glue around the outside of the bottom part of the body tube here. Then I'm going to flip it upside down, and I'll push a centering ring in place. And then I'm going to put wood glue on the top of the centering ring and then push a second centering ring in place. Then I can wipe off the excess wood glue and put it back in place, make sure it stays flat. Alright, with the bead in place, I'm going to turn the body tube upside down, and I'll change the camera. Okay, now with the body tube upright the way it's supposed to be, I'm going to push the centering ring all the way down into position. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add another layer of wood glue. First round on the body tube itself, and then I'm going to smear some on the centering ring. So with that in place now, I'm just going to slide the second centering ring on top, like so. Right up against the lower centering ring. And before I lift up the body tube here, I'm just going to come around one more time, make a nice little fillet here, just to add a little bit of extra strength. And we're going to let this assembly dry before moving on to the paper shroud that goes on top of it. Alright, there we go. With the rings mostly in place, I'm just going to remove them, and I'm going to wipe off the excess wood glue with a paper towel, and then I'll set it back in position and let the rings set up. Alright, just going back to a wider angle here, I took care of wiping off the excess wood glue and made the fillet on the top here look real nice. I'm just going to set the body tube back in place, and I've got kind of a heavy jar here. I'm just going to set that on top. This will hold the body tube nice and square against the table. Just going to push on the centering rings one more time to make sure that they're nice and flat on the table, and I'll leave this alone while the wood glue dries. Now that the wood glue is dried on the lower centering rings, we're going to install the paper transition from the body tube to the lower centering rings. Here's the transition right here. The nice thing about this kit is that it already comes pre-cut out, so you don't have to cut it out from a sheet of paper. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get it into position, tape it in place, and then the instructions recommend painting the inside of the paper with epoxy and sliding the transition down. So I'm going to do that. Okay, so here's the paper shroud taped together and set into position. As you can see, the overlap area is on the same part of the body tube where the rail buttons are going to go. Remember that every rocket has a Hollywood side and a rail side, so if you have overlaps and unsightly bits like this, if you can rotate them to the rail side, then that works out really well. So all I'm going to do now is just kind of slide the shroud up a bit. I'll mix up some epoxy, and we'll paint that on the inside of the shroud, a little bit on the aft ring here, and then we'll set it into position. Okay, so for this step I'm using Bob Smith 30-minute epoxy. I've got that all mixed up here, and I set it next to a heater as well just to help make it a little bit more runny. I'm going to try applying it before, or without adding any alcohol, just see if I can just put the epoxy straight on. And I don't have a brush, I'm just using a popsicle stick, and I'm fine with that. I'm sure it'll be easy enough to coat the paper completely. So I'll just work my way all the way around this shroud, and then we'll set it into position. Alright, so I'm pretty satisfied with the coverage of epoxy that I got on the shroud here. So I'm going to turn the whole body tube upright, and then I'm going to slide the shroud into place, and then the epoxy will kind of run due to gravity onto the aft ring here. That'll give it a nice internal fillet. And then I'll grab my paper towel and start wiping off any excess epoxy before it sets up. Alright, as you can see, the shroud is still lined up with the rail button line. So I'm just going to slide this thing into place here. Sorry if my hands are getting in the way. There we go. So that's sitting nicely on the aft ring. I'm going to come back with my paper towel, wipe up the excess epoxy, and after the epoxy cures, I'm going to come back with wood glue as well, just on the top part of the shroud to make sure it has a real nice seal. And in addition, I'll have to take the tape off, add a little wood glue in there just to make sure that the overlap is sealed as well. Okay, there we go. All the excess epoxy has been taken care of. We're just going to let the epoxy set up here. And the nice thing about Bob Smith epoxy is they say it's a 30-minute set time. It really is, versus the rock epoxy, which says it's a 1-hour set time. But if it's anything less than about 75 degrees in your shop, it seems like it takes an entire day to set up. So should be able to get back to work pretty quickly on this thing. With the skirt in position, it's time to install the motor mount. Now the instructions would have me add one ring of epoxy just for the aft centering ring, and then later come back and epoxy this coupler into place to reinforce the upper part of the booster section. Now when I put in the epoxy here, there's a chance that some epoxy could fall into the slots where the fins are going to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take advantage of the cold weather and the longer set time for the epoxy, and I'm going to install the motor mount, the coupler, and the fins all in one session here in the shop today. As I mentioned earlier, there are 3 different 4-inch couplers included in the kit. One of them has a rough surface. This is the coupler that we want to use for reinforcing the body tube. So I'm just going to move this out of the way here. Now it's always a good idea to test fit your parts before using any glue. When I installed the motor mount here, I found that it took some sanding to get it to fit in the body tube, which is just fine. And then placing the coupler into position, I realized that the washer here on the eye bolt goes right up against the edge here. So that would prevent the coupler tube from coming all the way down and touching that centering ring. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a small notch here in the coupler, so that'll sit on top of the washer right there and just create a nice strong joint right up against that centering ring. Okay, here we go. I'm not sure how well you can see that, but just a little work on the Dremel. Real easy to make a notch right there, and now the coupler sits tight against that centering ring. So I'll just make sure that I align the coupler really well when I install it in place. Last thing I need to do here is prepare the fins for installation. Now they come with some protective covering on them, and we're going to leave most of that on, but the instructions recommend cutting off the bottom part, of course, so you get a good glue joint there, and going up about 1/4 of an inch when you cut off the protective covering here, so you can make a small fillet. You can leave the rest of it on, which works great for masking when you go to paint the rocket. Of course, all it needs to just kind of reinforce some of that with a little bit more masking tape. But this is what it looks like when you cut the bottom part off. I've just gone up about 1/4 inch there, remove the covering, and then next I'm going to really scuff up the plastic as good as I can, and then the fins will be ready for installation. After removing the paper covering and sanding the tabs on the fins, I had put all the fins into position here, as well as the motor mount, and the kit includes a fin guide, which is really great. Just took a little bit of light sanding and it fits on the body tube perfect. It doesn't go very far up on the fins, but because it's plywood, it's very strong. It's a lot stronger than the typical paper and foam board guides that I normally make. So this will be perfect for holding the fins into position. So when I glue everything together, I'm actually going to end up just setting the rocket vertical like this, and that way it'll just sit up just fine. I'll put the coupler in as well, and you can put the weight on, and that'll push the motor mount right up into position. That aft centering ring will be pushing up on the tabs on the fins, locking everything into position. Okay, so let's get started here. I've got my first batch of epoxy mixed up. I use about 30 grams. I figured that'll get me through most of the fins and the motor mount itself, and I'm more than ready to mix up another batch if needed. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start by spreading some epoxy in the fin areas here. Just get a nice amount of epoxy in there. It makes it a little bit less messy to do it this way versus putting it on the fins and then double buttering and all that. So we'll just add a little bit going on like so. Spread it out. We'll get more on as we go, but this will be a good start here. And I should mention when we put the motor mount in, the orientation doesn't really matter as long as the fin pockets are lined up with the fin slots. The eye bolt on the top is well clear of where any fins would be. So it doesn't look like I'm spreading that much epoxy right now, but there'll be more once we put the fins on. And once you put the fin into position, it'll squish that epoxy out, and then the pockets will keep it right on that fin there and make a nice fillet out of it. There we go. Yeah, just a nice amount of epoxy. Alright, so that'll be enough for the initial dosing of epoxy into the fin pockets here. So I'm going to take the motor mount and slide it part way into the body tube. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go around on the inside of the body tube here with a bead of epoxy, so that'll catch the aft centering ringing as I push it in. Okay, there we go. I've got some epoxy in where the aft centering ring is going to go. So I'm just going to slide the motor mount into position here. And when I get the aft centering ring up to where it should be, I'm just going to start twisting this motor mount. And that'll help spread out that epoxy. Just make a nice ring for the aft centering ring to get plenty of epoxy on it. There we go. Now I'll just line up one of the fin pockets here with the fin slot. And there we go. And I'll start epoxying the fin tabs and we'll put them into position. Alright, batch 2 of the epoxy is ready to go. That was another 30 grams of epoxy. And it might be hard to tell in the video, but I have sanded the tabs and then I went back and cleaned them with some denatured alcohol. You want to make sure you get any of that plastic dust off of there so the epoxy is actually attaching to the tab itself and not just the dust. So I'm going to add some bead of epoxy to the fins here, put them into position, then we'll get the fin guide into place. So you can see I'm just putting a nice big bead of epoxy on there. There's no centering ring on the front part of the tab here, so it's not really necessary to build the epoxy up too high on that. There we go. Spilled a little, that's alright. We'll come back and clean up whatever excess epoxy is there. Alright, with the first fin in place, I'm going to push the body tube down so that pushes the motor mount into position. And we'll wipe off the excess epoxy as soon as I'm able here. Alright, there's fin number 4 into position here. I'm just going to take a paper towel, wipe off the excess epoxy, and I'll put the fin guide into place. Fins are all in position here. Just going to set the fin guide into place here. And as I do that, I'm just pushing the whole body tube down so that the fins are pushing up against the aft centering ring on the motor mount. And I'm going to come back with another paper towel here, get some more of that excess epoxy off. And I'm going to tape all the fins in place so they're nice and tight against the body tube. Once I'm done with that, we'll move on to the coupler. All the fins are secure and the motor mount's in place. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the remaining epoxy, add just a little bit of denatured alcohol to it to thin it out. Then I'm going to coat the inside of the body tube and install the coupler here. With the epoxy thinned out a bit, I'm going to add it inside the body tube here, pretty far down, but not all the way down because I want the coupler to be able to catch it and smear that epoxy down as I push it into position. After all this epoxy cures, I can come back and add a fillet if I'd like. But I just want to get this into place right now and get the coupler into position. Now, if you've ever put a big coupler into position before, you probably already know this, but I absolutely do not recommend using wood glue for a step like this, because that wood glue, when it gets thin, when you're smearing it out with the coupler, it can catch. And that cardboard will lock into position and you will not be able to move it again. So that's why epoxy is highly recommended for this step. Just make sure you get enough in there that the coupler will be able to smear it all around. There, that'll be enough. I'm going to make sure that I have the notch down on the coupler, and I'm going to push it into position, make sure that the notch is lined up with where the eye bolt is. Okay, that was a lot of epoxy and a lot of pieces to put together at the same time, but everything's into position and I've wiped off any excess epoxy that I've seen seep out. So we're just going to let this whole assembly set up and let the epoxy cure. Since I have the epoxy out and the workbench is a mess anyway, let's talk about the boosters. The most important thing about gluing on the nose cone and the tail cones to the boosters is making sure that they're in the correct orientation. So take a look at the body tube of the rocket as well as the boosters and see how the couplers are a different shape here, or the standoffs here. So make sure that your nose cone goes on the top and then the nozzle is going to go on the bottom. Now these are 3D printed plastic parts here. They're going to need some filling and sanding. And what I'm going to do is, just because these are all going to be one piece, the nose cones don't come off of the boosters, is I'm going to glue them into position first and then I'll fill and sand them. That'll make it look like a nice one-piece unit. I'm going to take these guys off here. There we go. Now one thing I did notice about the nose cones is that there's one band of filament that goes on right at the top here, right where the shoulder of the nose cone is. And that prevents it from sliding all the way into the booster tube. So I could take a knife and try and slowly get that plastic off, but the easiest way to take care of it is just to sand a little notch in the top part of the booster tube, and then the nose cone will sit all the way flush. Okay, I have both the nose cones fitted to the booster tube, so I'm just going to epoxy them in place. Just use rocket epoxy for that. Once again, make sure you have the orientation of the pre-cut holes the correct direction, otherwise it's going to be a major problem later when you try and attach the boosters to the body tube. I'm going to put the epoxy on the inside of the body tube here, and that way it won't smear everywhere when I put the nose cone on. There we go, so I'll just mount the nose cones into position here, just rotate them as I get them in place, and that'll really spread the epoxy out real nice. Then I'm going to get a little bit of masking tape on there to hold the nose cones in position while the epoxy cures. There we go. That'll put the nose cones in place real well. I'll secure them with some masking tape, and then after the epoxy cures I'll come back and I'm going to smooth everything out and get it sanded looking real nice. The Omega kit comes with a number of 3D printed plastic parts. We've got 3 nose cones and 3 scale nozzles. Now like all other 3D printed parts, these pieces come a little bit rough. And the instructions recommend using thinned out 20-minute epoxy to spread over and then come back and sand. If you've seen my Bullet Bobby video, you've seen a technique that I like to use that works pretty well for me, and that's just using medium CA. So all I do is I just go along the nose cone, add the medium CA, and then I'm going to just smear it around, smooth it out with some wax paper. And I'll just allow that to dry, and I'll sand the nose cone here. Usually a little bit rougher grit, like 180, maybe 150 works pretty well. And it can take more than one coating, and that's fine. You just put as much effort as you want into the rocket to get the finish that you want. The nice thing about these conical nose cones is that it's easy enough to use a flat sanding bar or an orbital sander. Just go all the way around the nose cone until it gets smooth. And if you notice any more divots, cracks, and holes, just come back again with the CA glue again. When you're done, it'll look something like this, nice and smooth. And I'm going to come back and just add a little bit of filler in the joint between the nose cone and the body tube, and this will be nice and smooth, ready to go. Okay, we're getting close to wrapping up the booster segment of this build here, and I know this video has been a long time coming. I promise I'm going to work a little bit harder on this rocket to try and get it finished for the flying season here. It's just been a crazy last few months, but I'm excited to keep working on the Omega. So anyway, this is what the solid rocket booster looks like when it's attached to the main body tube here. As you can see, I have completed all the fillets on the fins here, and those are going to be just great. Now I talked about smoothing out the nose cone here. I need to do so on the main motor bell here. However, I'm not going to do the motor bell on the booster tubes. The reason for that is we're going to replace this static one with an actual motor mount. Yep, that's right. This rocket's going to be a 3-motor cluster. I'm going to have 29mm motors on the boosters and 54mm in the main. This is what it's going to look like here. The motors will stick all the way down here so I don't burn the main motor bell. And this rocket's going to fly on 3 motors. Very excited about that. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. These boosters will not be separating, and I'll explain why in the next video. Mostly it's just for convenience sake. But anyway, this is where the build is right now, and I can't glue in the motor tubes just yet. A couple other things I need to do. I'm going to talk about that in the next video. I know this build video has been a long time coming here, and I promise I'm going to work hard on getting the Omega ready for flight for flying season here. It's been a crazy few months here at home. But I've been super busy, and now I'm excited to get back to work on the rocket. So thanks for sticking with me. I've got some more launch videos coming up soon. June Swoosh is on for this year at Tri-Cities Rocketry, so I'm excited to be attending that this year. I'll be sure to get lots of launch videos. It's been 2 years since we've had a real big event, and I'm excited to see what all the new projects everyone's been working on. I'll see you next time.